Margaret stood behind the polished marble counter of the Grand Sterling Hotel and watched as the afternoon light filtered through the crystal chandeliers above her head, and she felt a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation running through her veins because today was her first day as the new owner of this magnificent establishment that had taken every penny of her inheritance and savings to acquire. She had spent 27 years as a devoted wife to Robert and mother to their 2 grown children, and during all those years she had dreamed of owning something of her own and building something that bore her mark on the world. And now, at 53 years old, she finally had her chance, even though the circumstances that brought her here were far from what she had imagined. The marriage had been comfortable, if not passionate, in recent years, and Robert had grown distant over the past 18 months, and there were late nights at the office and business trips that seemed to multiply, and Margaret had felt the shift but had chosen to focus on her own dreams instead of dwelling on suspicions that would only break her heart. Her lawyer had suggested she hire a private investigator, but Margaret refused because some truths were better left unconfirmed until the right moment arrived, and she had instead poured all her energy into the hotel acquisition and learning every detail of the business from the previous owner who had become a dear friend and mentor during the transition. The front desk manager, Sarah, approached with a warm smile and informed Margaret that everything was ready for the evening check-ins and the staff had been briefed about the new ownership, and everyone seemed genuinely excited about the changes Margaret planned to implement, including better wages and improved working conditions. Margaret had always believed that kindness started from the top and trickled down through an organization, and she wanted her hotel to be known, not just for luxury, but for the genuine care and warmth that guests would feel from every interaction with her staff. As she reviewed the reservation list for the evening, her eyes stopped on a familiar name and her heart skipped several beats because there it was in black and white. Robert Henderson, and guest for the premium suite on the 5th floor with check-in scheduled for 4 o'clock that very afternoon. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper, and Sarah noticed immediately and asked if everything was all right, and Margaret simply nodded and said that yes, everything was perfectly fine, and she excused herself to her office where she sat down and tried to process what she had just discovered. So this was how the truth would reveal itself, and not through a private investigator or a confrontation, but through the simple act of her husband bringing his mistress to her hotel without knowing she owned it. And Margaret felt an odd sense of calm wash over her, because at least now she would finally know. She thought about her children, David and Claire, who were both married with families of their own, and how they had noticed their father's distance during recent family gatherings, and Claire had even mentioned to Margaret that something seemed off, but Margaret had brushed it aside, saying that people changed as they aged, and sometimes couples needed space to grow. But this wasn't growth, and this was betrayal. Plain and simple. And yet Margaret found herself not feeling the rage or devastation she might have expected, and instead she felt a strange sense of liberation, because the uncertainty that had plagued her for months was about to end. She returned to the front desk at 3:45 and positioned herself where she could observe the entrance while appearing to review paperwork, and her staff moved around her with practiced efficiency, and the hotel hummed with the quiet activity of a well-run establishment. At precisely 4 o'clock, the glass doors opened and Robert walked in wearing his best charcoal suit and the cologne she had given him for Christmas, and on his arm was a woman who looked to be in her early 30s with long dark hair and a burgundy dress that shimmered under the lobby lights. Margaret watched as Robert approached the desk with the confidence of a man who believed himself invisible and untouchable, and the young woman clung to his arm with an expression that mixed excitement and something that looked almost like genuine affection. Sarah greeted them professionally and asked for identification and a credit card, and Robert handed over his wallet while making small talk about how he had heard wonderful things about the hotel and wanted to surprise his companion with a special evening. The young woman giggled and leaned into him and called him generous and sweet, and Margaret observed the interaction with the detachment of someone watching a play unfold on stage, and she noticed how Robert seemed more animated than he had been at home in years, and how he laughed at the woman's jokes with genuine amusement. Sarah processed the check-in with her usual efficiency, and was about to hand over the keycards when Margaret stepped forward and placed her hand gently on Sarah's arm and said in a clear voice that she would personally escort these special guests to their suite. Robert's head snapped up at the sound of her voice, and his face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Confusion, followed by recognition, followed by absolute horror. The color drained from his face, and he stood frozen with his hand extended for the keycards, and his mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, and the young woman looked between them with growing confusion and asked Robert what was happening. Margaret smiled with genuine warmth and said that she was Margaret Henderson and the new owner of the Grand Sterling Hotel, and that it was quite a surprise to see her husband Robert here this afternoon, and she hoped they would enjoy their stay. The lobby seemed to fall silent, although staff and guests continued moving around them, and Robert finally found his voice and stammered that he could explain, and this wasn't what it looked like, and Margaret simply raised her hand gently to stop him. She said that explanations could wait because right now she had a hotel to run and guests to attend to, and she suggested that perhaps Robert and his friend might want to reconsider their accommodation plans for the evening, and that she would have Sarah cancel the reservation with no penalty. The young woman, whose name Margaret would later learn was Jessica, suddenly pulled away from Robert, and her face had gone pale as well. And she said in a shaky voice that she had no idea Robert was married, and that he had told her he was divorced, and that she would never have agreed to any of this if she had known the truth. Margaret looked at Jessica with compassion rather than anger, because she recognized something in the younger woman's eyes that reminded her of herself many years ago. The desire to believe in romance and the willingness to trust too easily. She told Jessica that she believed her, and that some men became very skilled at deception when they wanted something badly enough, and that Jessica deserved better than to be used as a pawn in someone else's midlife crisis. Robert tried to interject, but Margaret's expression silenced him more effectively than any shouting could have, and she turned to Sarah and asked her to please call a taxi for their guest, Jessica, and to charge it to the hotel as a courtesy. Jessica accepted gratefully, and before leaving, she approached Margaret and apologized with tears in her eyes and thanked her for her kindness, and Margaret simply touched her arm and told her to be more careful about trusting smooth-talking men who seemed too good to be true. After Jessica left, Margaret finally turned her full attention to Robert, who looked smaller somehow than he had when he walked in, and the confidence and swagger had evaporated completely, and what remained was a middle-aged man who had been caught in a moment of spectacular foolishness. She invited him to join her in her office, and he followed like a chastised schoolboy, and once the door closed behind them, Margaret sat behind her desk and gestured for Robert to take the chair across from her. The silence stretched between them until finally Robert started making excuses about how the marriage had felt stale, and how he had felt invisible and unappreciated, and how Jessica had made him feel young again, and Margaret listened without interrupting until he ran out of words. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm and measured, and she told him that she understood feeling invisible because she had felt that way for years, and that she understood wanting something more from life because that was exactly why she had bought this hotel. She explained that while he had been seeking validation through an affair, she had been building something real and lasting, and that while he had been lying to her and to Jessica, she had been honest about her dreams and her plans even when he showed no interest in hearing about them. Robert tried to apologize, but Margaret told him that apologies were premature because first they needed to discuss practical matters, and she suggested that they would need to separate their lives in an orderly fashion, and that she hoped they could do so with dignity and mutual respect. She said that she didn't hate him and didn't want to punish him, but that she also couldn't continue in a marriage where trust had been broken, and where they had clearly grown into different people with different values and different priorities. Robert asked if there was any chance of reconciliation, and Margaret considered the question carefully before responding that she didn't think so because even before this moment she had realized that they had been living parallel lives rather than a shared one. She told him that she wished him well and hoped he would find whatever it was he was searching